Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Good morning again, and welcome to our study in the Word. Dr. Magnus and I are so glad to meet with you Sunday mornings, and I hope you realize that you can watch us on YouTube as well, anytime of day or night. We're always glad to have the opportunity to talk about the Scripture with you. We have been in a series of lessons on the theme of God's urgent call. And we have seen that in Israel's early history in the time of the Judges. And more recently, we've been looking at God's urgent call of prophetic figures and their role in Israel's history and in the development of God's revelatory plan. So this morning, we have one of the later prophets, Ezekiel. He comes on the scene at the time when Jerusalem and Judah are falling to the Babylonians, and we're going to track him and see how the call of God worked in his life, and we hope to learn something that will help us as well. Lee, here we are in the exile.
Well, we're in the exile, and we've got Ezekiel, who has got to be one of the most unusual of the prophetic characters in the Old Testament.
I would have to agree. I think he is, yes, the most unusual. But what makes him unusual? How would you put that?
Well, he's unique in his setting, having most of his prophetic career, virtually all of his prophetic career, from exile. So he's speaking in a different place and a different time. He also uses some very strange methodology to communicate God's message.
Yes.
And he has amazing visions.
He has the visions. They're wild.
They are wild. People are familiar with them. They're the wheel within the wheel, and the strange creatures, and the valley.
And some of these strange creatures show up later in New Testament.
That's true.
And of all places, the book of Revelation. That ought to put you on guard right there, I think.
But he's got a great message about the presence of God in the midst of his people who are in captivity and who are more yet going to be taken into captivity.
Well, Jeremiah, whom we looked at previously, also lived during this time and was just a little bit older contemporary. He never went to Babylon.
Right.
He stayed back in the Holy Land. But Ezekiel, being a priest, a high-ranking priest, was taken as a prisoner of war along with other leading characters in the government of Jerusalem and Judea.
Ezekiel was taken off in the second of the three captivities.
That's what it appears to be.
Daniel appears to have been taken off in the first, and Ezekiel in the second.
Yes.
And so his prophetic work starts even before the final destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of the bulk of the population.
Now, with Jerusalem, we know this much from reading later in the book, that Ezekiel is in Babylon when Jerusalem fell, because there's an account of what happened in his own personal life. On the day the word came of the fall of Jerusalem, his wife died, but he was told, do not mourn her death.
Because the suffering was so widespread back in Jerusalem.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we know where he was in 587 or 6.
Yeah.
He's definitely in Babylon by that time.
Now, the call of Ezekiel, which we're focusing on in our lesson today, is described actually in two full chapters.
Three. In 3 chapters, the first 3 chapters are the...
You're considering chapter 1 to be part of the call.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, where he sees this vision of God enthroned.
Right. Now, prophets in the Old Testament receive revelations from God in two forms, at least two forms, maybe more. But the first form, he is in the form of a vision. He sees it. Same is true of Jeremiah. What do you see, Jeremiah? And then after having seen this, then he hears the voice of God. So it is both visionary and auditory.
Yeah. We might mention that the message of Ezekiel is really twofold. At the first, the message is one of warning and lamentation, warning and mourning, because he's prophesying the imminent downfall of Jerusalem.
And he gives all the reasons. He seems to have superhuman vision like Superman. He can see through walls, and he sees what's going on. I think this is a metaphor.
Well, he was a priest back in Jerusalem.
And
he knows what's going on
back there. He knows where various things are going on that are travesty. Right on the temple grounds, pagan deities are being worshipped behind closed doors. And he really hits that very, very hard.
So the first part is focusing on warning of Judah about upcoming destruction because
and the reasons
of their
for it.
Idolatry. Yeah. There's a middle part that's kind of an interlude where he turns his focus on God's will for other nations.
God's judgment.
Judgment on other nations.
Yes.
And then he ends with an interesting section giving hope to Judah.
Some of the most blessed words of all. And the last chapters of Ezekiel 40 through 48 are a description of what Jerusalem will become in God's great day.
Yeah, the glory of God is just going to spill over into the lives of a restored Judah.
And the temple will be rebuilt. And in fact, the terrain will be redesigned and reordered, and it will be glorious, you see. Now, the thing that has always impressed me about Ezekiel is he seems always out of step with what appears to be historical reality, because when things look to be fairly safe and secure in Jerusalem, he knows better, and so he is just raging at them and telling them, oh, it's terrible, and God's wrath is going to fall on you. When the city does collapse and is burned, destroyed, then he talks about how great and glorious the future is going to be.
That's the prophetic message right there, isn't it? Yes.
He seems to be backwards.
Yes, but that's a true prophet. Our text begins in chapter 3, verse 1. I'd like for us to mention that those verses are set up by the last few verses in chapter 2.
Yes.
Where God instructs the prophet to open his mouth and eat what I give you. And in his vision, what he sees being given to him is a scroll. And the scroll is described as having been written on front and on back, and that the words are words of woe. They're words of lamentation.
Destruction.
Yeah.
Here we need to realize the fact that the scroll is written on front and back suggests that it is not vellum or parchment scroll, but a scroll of parchment. Papyrus. Papyrus.
Yeah.
I don't know what papyrus tastes like, but I don't think it tasted like honey.
Probably not.
But the words in his mouth as he symbolically eats the scroll is the words are like honey, sweet.
Right.
Even though it's lamentation and woe.
I think the first the reference to front and back also suggests that there's nothing to be added. I mean,
it's full.
It's
full. The full story.
It's God's will, and they need to take it as God's completed will. Well, let me read.
Just let me outline chapter 3 a little bit, because here are the commissions that he receives. He's told 5 things to do, And what we're going to be reading here is the first one. But there are several others that are really profound. And I think the most profound one is the one, number 4, which is later in chapter 3. And I'm sorry it's not in the text, because it really announces a whole new concept of responsibility and individual responsibility. Ezekiel is the prophet who best announced the whole concept that the individual Israelite is as responsible as any other. And you are a watchman, he is told, a sentinel, a guy who is standing on the wall looking for danger. And when you see danger, you have a responsibility, not to turn and run, but to announce the coming danger and to warn everybody. Now, if you warn them and they don't listen, then they will fall and they will be destroyed. But I will hold you innocent of your responsibility. If you see the danger coming and don't warn them and they are destroyed or saved, I will hold you personally responsible for what happens. All that blood will be on you.
It's a great image for a prophet of this guard in the guard tower watching
It is the
horizon.
best definition of leadership and the responsibility of leadership. And not to take the easy track to avoid difficulty and problems, but to tell the truth, tell the story, and warn.
Yeah. First, the responsibility of seeing the situation as it exists, and second, the responsibility of communicating it intelligently and compellingly.
Compellingly.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good choice of a description.
All right. So here are the words of the sentinel, the watchman.
The first commission, yes.
Okay. Chapter 3, verse 1. And he said to me, Son of man, eat what is before you. Eat this scroll. Then go and speak to the people of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he gave me the scroll to eat. Then he said to me, Son of man, eat this scroll I am giving you, and fill your stomach with it. So I ate it, and it tasted as sweet as honey in my mouth. He then said to me, Son of man, go now to the people of Israel, and speak my words to them. You are not being sent to a people of obscure speech and strange language, but to the people of Israel. Not to many peoples of the obscure speech and strange language, whose words you cannot understand. Surely if I had sent you to them, they would have listened to you. But the people of Israel are not willing to listen to you, because they are not willing to listen to me. For all the Israelites are hardened and obstinate. But I will make you as unyielding and hardened as they are. I will make your forehead like the hardest stone, harder than flint. Do not be afraid of them or terrified by them, though they are a rebellious people. And he said to me, Son of man, listen carefully and take to heart all the words I speak to you. Go now to your people in exile and speak to them. Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, whether they listen or fail to listen.
Yeah, there is that. How they respond is not your responsibility.
Exactly.
But you say what you're told to say to them.
Yeah. Jesus makes good use of this message when he's sending out the apostles. He sends them out 2 by 2, and he says, when you come to a village, if they listen to you, great. Stay there for a while and share my message with them that the kingdom has come. If they aren't willing to listen, fine. Don't beat your head against the wall. Don't try to convince them. Just go on to the next village. And he said, as you leave, know this, you have brought the kingdom near. I think that's a fascinating...
You did what you could.
You did all you could. You're not responsible for their response.
Well, I think into Acts, in the life of Paul, how many times he would go and speak, and many would listen, and then people would start objecting to him, and they would, and he just would leave the synagogue. And wasn't there a statement something like he shook out the dust off his feet?
Yes, and that was a rabbinic practice that Jesus and his apostles used as well.
Yeah. So, and not only did Jesus announce the principle of moving on, but Paul practiced it, and the early evangelists.
Yeah. So there are two interesting things we get out of that. One is that you don't have to stay and feel responsible for other people's acceptance or rejection. The other is not to use people's potential rejection as an excuse not to tell them the good news.
In the first place. Yeah, I know they won't listen, so I won't bother.
I won't even bother. Yeah.
Now, there are a few things in the text we need to elucidate and
let's talk
explain.
about that Son of Man phrase that reappears.
That's the place to start.
It not only recurs several times in this passage for today, it's throughout the book of Ezekiel.
93 times.
Yeah. So what
he is always addressed by God as, and in Hebrew it's Ben Adam. It is not Ben Enosh, son of weak, a weak creature, but son of Adam.
Adam meaning humanity.
Humanity.
All of humanity.
Yes.
So it emphasizes his own humanness.
Yes.
Humanity.
But see, he's a priest.
So he represents.
Yeah,
humanity.
he has to represent humanity before God, and he has to represent God before humanity. He's the man in between.
The man in the middle.
The man in the middle.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So he is being told something, and this whole definition of Son of Man is a concept which begins earlier in the Old Testament time and then grows, and by the time we get to the New Testament, when Jesus uses it of himself, it's already changed into something very, very different. But it's still the man in the middle. Even as
Jesus is quintessentially the man in the middle.
Exactly. Now, the terminology in our translation, and at the end of verse 1 and elsewhere in the rest of the passage where it has people of Israel, is actually the house of Israel. And it's like this is one big family. That's what's being emphasized here. You all belong to one another. You're in this gigantic family named Israel. Now notice, there is no northern kingdom.
Yeah, well, we might point that out historically. The date in which Ezekiel begins his prophetic ministry is 593.
Yes.
The northern kingdom, Israel, has been non-existent since 722. So that's 125
now,
years.
in place of that, there were these kind of a mixed breed between some Israelites that were left over and some foreigners from far away that had been moved in, and they intermarried. And today there are descendants of them still in that area of the West Bank. We call them Samaritans.
Right. But
Judah, they are not a part.
They're not really accepted as part of the people of God.
No.
All that's really left of the people of God is Judah.
And Jerusalem.
Judah and Jerusalem.
Two entities.
Yeah. And what's interesting here is that instead of addressing Judah as Judah, Ezekiel goes back and takes that old, more general term, Israel, and applies it to them.
Now, I think that is very significant because he is envisioning and using this language in that way, the old term. He is looking for a time in the future where things will return to previous unity.
So the full restoration of Israel, not just that one little tribal region.
Right.
What about the significance of the symbolism of eating? I assume that has something to do with the importance of internalizing the message of God.
Right.
Is that, okay.
Well, that's the whole point. Yeah. And this is true in all of the prophets, that they are all given visions and hear the voice of God, and they are somehow or another selected by God for the message of God to be internalized.
Yeah.
We would say planted in the soul, in the heart.
Yeah.
in
Well,
the mind.
that's important, I think, for us as Christians as well, because it's possible to hear the message of God and even pass on the message of God, communicate it, without it having a transforming inner presence in our lives.
Well, we participate even in our own time within the Christian community in Holy Communion. And in Holy Communion, we are doing, the term for humanity, one of the terms in Hebrew is flesh and blood.
Mm-hmm.
And flesh and blood, Jesus was flesh and blood.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have the presence of the flesh and the blood in the elements of Holy Communion. And we do this, why? Because we're told to do it, but what is the point? The point is we are internalizing at Holy Communion the power, the presence, sustenance from Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And it's the same point that he was making, I think, when he said, I am the bread of life.
Right.
Because there's the idea of eating of him, that is internalizing his person, his presence in our lives.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, are there any other comments on this first part? I just always make a comment about you're going to people who don't speak a hard language, and that was my proof positive that Hebrew is an easy language.
Oh, is that right? I didn't find it all that easy. Well, what is it? Before we get to the new language, you had mentioned earlier, sweet as honey, and it's here in verse 3 that we see that phrase. If this is a message of mourning and lamentation and woe, what do you suppose makes it a sweet message?
How does that fit? It sounds out of, like most things, many prophets say, there's a hidden message in it. And I think the hidden message in this is hope.
Yeah, I think so.
We are facing doom. We have to lament what has happened. We have to understand that it is our fault.
Yeah.
And we have failed, and there are consequences when you fail, but don't give up.
Right.
All is not lost. There can be a new day that will be a good day.
So in spite of the destruction that's to come, God is good, and God's will is good. And so insofar as this scroll contains the whole will of God, not just half the will of God, that destruction is coming, but the whole will of God, that is that God will bring restoration, and that's what we see in the last part of Ezekiel.
That's how, the end of Ezekiel. You know, the early part is so gloomy. I mean, he is you talk about being in a depression. He seems to be catatonic, unable to speak, unable to move. And it's a terrible scene to see what this man went through. But how glorious is the end of this book.
Yeah. Now this language you were mentioning comes up in verses 5 and 6. When they were taken into Babylonian captivity, and when the rest of them come into captivity in a few years, they're going to be pretty much forced to adopt the language of the Babylonians, right?
Well, and I tell you what, I have had a rare experience for which I'm thankful, and in my doctoral studies I have read some Neo-Babylonian.
Okay.
And I can swear that it is a hard language.
It's a hard language, okay. Good.
It is a Semitic language, but it is an East Semitic language. But to read it, you have to know something like 600 different signs and how to read them. And each sign may have a dozen different ways it's used.
Wow.
So it is a language for professional scribes. Now the language of Israel is alphabetic, 22 letters. And even the simplest of us can handle it, and so it is a good language.
Yeah. It's interesting that Ezekiel's original call was to focus on the people of God, the house of Israel,
right,
and not speak to the other nations, other peoples, but he will eventually address
Yes.
God's will
Yes.
for those other nations.
And it will be judgment in that center section
on
of
them
the
as
book.
well. Yeah.
You know, we just have a few minutes left. I really enjoy this book so much that we could go on talking about various parts of it. But how to apply what we have looked at in Ezekiel this morning to our own experience in a new age, very, very different. We don't have prophets like Ezekiel anymore. What do we learn from this, would you say, in our Christian experience?
Yeah. Okay. I think one of the things we learn is that when we do attempt to share God's will and the coming kingdom and the good news of Jesus Christ, we need to expect resistance. Not everyone is going to accept it readily. Or
Well,
maybe ever.
Jesus told a parable to that effect, the parable of the sower and the
Right,
seed.
that's true. But the complement to that, he says in verse 9, do not be afraid, do not be terrified. In other words, even though we are warned to expect some resistance, we are also challenged to maintain faith in God and not be afraid.
Well, you know, the enemy, or those that refuse to accept it, are said to have a forehead as hard as flint. Well, this same word is sometimes used for a diamond.
That's hard.
It's pretty hard.
But then he says that Ezekiel needs to be, he's going to make him just as hard-headed, right?
Sometimes when we go out into the world, we face hard-headed resistance. And I think what Ezekiel is being told, I'm going to make your head as hard as theirs,
Don't give
or
up.
harder.
Don't give up.
Don't
Yeah,
give up.
Yeah. Take heart.
What else do you think? I think always the message from God is always hope. No, you know, I had a dear friend who's passed on, and he had a saying, and it really applied to his life. Life is hard, but God is good. And I think that is some of what Ezekiel is saying. I can't imagine what it was like for Ezekiel, who was well-placed, wealthy, a man of authority and power, to be ripped out of that and hauled off like a dog
Living in a refugee camp in another country.
to another country. And we have seen some refugees from other lands in our own time.
And he was
I can't
ripped.
imagine how horrible
He
that
was
was.
ripped away from his whole reason for being. He was called to be a prophet, but over there in Babylon, there was no temple for him to work in.
He could not function
his whole
as a
life.
priest.
Yeah.
So he was left with the prophetic message,
right.
which is hold people up, hold them responsibility, but give them a view of a future.
Be a watchman.
Be a watchman and do your job. Don't quit. Well, it's time for us to get out of here, and I wish we could go a little bit longer on Ezekiel. Talk about that part where the hope is to be found in the latter chapters. But we can't do that. So next week we're going to have one more prophet, and this is going to be one who is also very, very interesting, Amos. Come back and join us. And we were so glad you could be with us, and God's blessing was on you today.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.